Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Order members, she continued. It is with reservation that I stand before you this evening alone to discuss the work I started in July. Professor Snape sends his apologies for his absence and has asked me to represent his contribution to this work. She noticed Dumbledore nod his head slowly in support of her last statement, and swallowed again in an attempt to regain her composure. Therefore what I tell you about this evening is a collaboration of Muggle science and wizard magic. I do not claim credit for the discovery alone. Nor do I wish to. For what I have to say is of a universal link between Muggles and wizards which does not belong to one person, but is a part of all of us. As she spoke, Cecilia felt more emboldened about what she was about to disclose. She nodded assertively around the room at the murmuring that had begun. Where to now? She thought, as the wizards fell silent again, and returned to looking at her expectantly. Cecilia began to feel nervous again. Here she was, before an audience where half of the wizards didn't want her there anyway the last time. Another who had tried murdering her too, before rescuing and kissing her. And another, who had insisted accompanying her back home, and had been a shoulder to lean on, smiling at her encouragingly. In fact, the group of people here had interests were connected in more than one way to what she was about to say. Concentrate, she told herself. You want the point to be heard. And Cecilia Frobisher put on her professional hat and proceeded to tell, not too succinctly and not too clearly, of the genetic link between Muggles, and the implications for the successful research into an effective and safe potion for Harry. It is with thanks to many Order members here that I am standing here this evening, able to share this work with you. Each one of you knows who you are, and I won't embarrass you by saying what you've done. Suffice to say, without you, the research would not be completed now, if at all. That is where we have got so far, she concluded, 15 minutes later, looking round the kitchen again, swallowing uneasily. As of this evening, that is. Cecilia stopped, for there was nothing more to say. When no one said anything, she smiled a little and was about to turn to Dumbledore when applause began. Arthur Weasley was on his feet, clapping furiously and grinning. One or two others joined him. Cecilia saw Remus clapping too, and Tonks. And at the front, Benjamin Wurgs was also applauding, though not as enthusiastically as Mr. Weasley. Cecilia smiled again, this time with more confidence and filled with a sort of happy calmness. All of her earlier nervousness had disappeared. Dumbledore stood up next to her, quelling the applause by waving his hands down. When there was near silence, he surveyed the Order before looking at Cecilia, who could feel her cheeks flush with latent conspicuousness. Before I call for questions, I feel that it is necessary to state this, to all. Dumbledore scanned the room in an arc, looking at each wizard in turn. The connection Mrs. Frobisher and indeed Severus Snape have made is as yet, like a black curtain. One tiny breakthrough, like a ray of light, has been made between Muggles and wizards, and though it is solitary, it is as firm as the foundations of everything that we hold dear. It is, as Mrs. Frobisher stated, a universal truth so fundamental to our world that the new weapon being developed in the form of the potion for Harry, is inextricably tied. Cecilia noticed the expressions on the faces of some of the wizards before her change, as if the underpinning of her presentation by Dumbledore had made them rethink what they were about to say. Now, without further ado, Mrs. Frobisher, are you prepared to take questions about the information you have just shared with us? Cecilia nodded, and looked for any raised hands. Yes, said Dumbledore, acknowledging Minerva McGonagall's raised hand. Minerva? Cecilia, said Minerva, nodding briefly in thanks to Dumbledore. You have completed this work successfully, as you stated, so I hear, at the meeting of the 16th of July. Do you intend to see out the work to its conclusion? That is, to the development of the potion for Harry? Cecilia stopped, and looked back at Minerva. Of all the possible questions that had run through her minutes since Dumbledore had insisted she present her findings at the Order meeting, This was one she had not prepared for. She began, feeling stupid at stumbling over a simple question. I intend to stay till the end of term, at Hogwarts, she began, looking uncertainly at Dumbledore. I hadn't actually thought about it. I mean, Severus has as much understanding of this than I have, and as far as the finished potion is concerned, I can hardly make it myself, being a mole. Cecilia smiled as she heard a few chuckles of laughter. I have yet to discuss it, she said, looking at Dumbledore, but will do all I can. She waited for Dumbledore to choose the question again, and he directed Bill Weasley to the floor. With respect, Mrs. Frobisher, but are you certain of our findings? It seemed like a popular question and the background noise rose to a dull roar. Dumbledore raised his hands again to call for quiet, and looked at Cecilia. She looked round the room, and her gaze rested for the first time on Sirius. I am certain. Should anyone want a whistle-stop tour of genetics, please do ask. But not only that. She paused. Lully. He was a wizard, and he had nearly got there. The credit was his, really. Had fate, circumstances, the goblin riots and so on, not got in the way. A wizard almost got there, just over 40 years ago. And had it not been for the goblin riots, he would have probably succeeded. She paused, and looked now at Remus. How much he had helped her, she thought. Unlike Sirius, who was full of noble action and sweeping deeds driven by emotion, Remus was reflective and thoughtful. He had been there for her when she needed someone. So? Asked Roland Bentwick, Anura sitting to her right. What was his name? Raymond Lully. It wasn't Cecilia who replied this time. Sirius Black was on his feet, and addressing the room. Apparently a relative of mine, distantly. He continued. Am I right? Cecilia nodded. But he died, during the goblin riots, continued Sirius, looking at Cecilia. Am I right? She shook her head this time. Sirius shot her a look. He was murdered, said Cecilia, as the attention was turned again to her. Hagrid told me he was standing right next to him at the time. If anyone has any further information about him, I would be happy to hear it. However, the point remains, she continued, determined to wrestle the conversation back to the relevant point. A wizard worked with mole scientists and came up with the same answer. That is, wizards are born and made. You can decide to be a wizard, or not. She looked at Kingsley Shacklebolt. Just as you were describing this evening, Mr. Shacklebolt, with those 3 wizards voluntarily giving up magic, she added, before looking back at Dumbledore. Please don't let there be any more questions, she thought. Her heart sank as a hand raised at the back. Yes, Remus. Dumbledore looked at Remus Lupin, who was looking at Cecilia. She smiled, waiting for the question. Do you think you'd be able to get to the bottom of it all, given time, that is? He smiled weakly and Cecilia smiled back. Sorry, Remus, she replied a little confused. Sirius jerked his head in Remus's direction. The bottom of what? The link. Do you think, if you were to work with moles again, you could solve the mystery entirely? Test other samples? Other variations in the genetics? He looked directly at her now, and not at the rest of the order. Why was he asking that? Cecilia wondered, when he knows I completed all the tests. It is possible, she conceded, but it depends on what question you might be looking for the answer to. I've looked at mole and wizard genetics, as you know, but No, interrupted Tonks, looking at Remus. He means, you've only looked at a small sample of wizards, but what about other genetic variations? Is it foolproof? Cecilia noticed Remus look urgently at Tonks. Is it safe? She added. Cecilia stopped, realizing that he was asking that all along, in his own way. We're not certain. At the moment, all we can say is that we have a potion that is suitable, that will control the flow of magic energy. We will make it as safe as we can." She looked around frantically at the growing noise again. Amongst them she could hear the wizards muttering. "See? It's not safe. Mull nonsense. Sirius will have something to say, no doubt." Silence. The kitchen fell silent, at Dumbledore's behest. Cecilia saw that all eyes were on Dumbledore now. The head of the order was addressing the room again. "You are correct. The work is not safe. It is entirely dangerous. However, this will not detract from 2 points." Again, he looked at each wizard in turn. Many lowered their gaze, and looked at the floor. Others, like Sirius, Remus, and Tonks, stared at Cecilia. The first is that Harry Potter has agreed to cooperate at every stage of this work and feels that although he has reservations and fears, he must continue. He is compelled to, and as such is prepared to face whatever dangers either the potion, or Voldemort bring. The second, he looked back at Cecilia, is that Mrs. Frobisher came here this evening to inform each and every one of us of a universal truth that exists between moles and wizards. We are related, make no mistake on that score. This we know absolutely now. She should be celebrated for finding that link, no matter how uncomfortably it sits with many of you. "Here, here," said Mrs. Weasley, getting up from her seat. She held her teacup aloft, as she spoke, and the warmth in her eyes made Cecilia's heart warm. "Mrs. Frobisher, Cecilia, well done," she declared, and looked back at Arthur, who was smiling up at her. "Yes," proclaimed Tonks. 3 cheers for Mrs. Frobisher, hip hip. Hooray! Hooray! Hurrah! Cecilia smiled. Now she was finally relieved of the burden of this. She smiled at Dumbledore as she returned to her seat in front of Sirius, knowing that within the parchment Snape had given to him that morning, the proof was written, and could be kept and used for right. "So, did you get all of that, Arthur?" asked Dumbledore, waiting for Mr. Weasley's enchanted quill to stop writing before he continued. "Just on the second hooray," said Mr. Weasley, glancing at the parchment. "Then we'll be with you." Half an hour later, and the meeting finally ended. Cecilia was glad, not least because she could move away from Sirius, who'd insisted on whispering childish comments to her as the rest of the order members scheduled to speak got to their feet, but because his warm breath on her neck by her ear was beginning to make her feel uncomfortable. At the end of the meeting, 2 hours later, Cecilia remained in her chair as the other wizards around her left the kitchen and headed into the living room. Many of them smiled in her direction, others waved, although others did neither, and walked out without acknowledgement. So, she had done it, she thought when there was no one else left in the room. She had addressed the order, found out what they wanted to know, and they were aware of the link now. All that was left was for Dumbledore to take her back to Hogwarts, so she could continue the work with Severus. Severus. Now her mind was clear of her burden. The image of him doubled up in pain re-entered her mind, and Cecilia began to feel a longing to return now, to find out how he was. She got to her feet, and felt a hand on her shoulder. "You did well," said Sirius, as she turned to look at him. "Hadn't he left? I would have been nervous too, if I were in your position." Cecilia smiled as he moved behind her to sit next to her. Clearly not. She smiled in his direction, hoping he would leave her alone. "So, are you joining us for a bite? Molly Weasley has spent all day cooking. I'm sure you won't want to miss out on homemade food." Cecilia nodded and got to her feet. "Just concentrate on going back to Hogwarts," she told herself firmly. "Do not, under any circumstances, think about the night before your birthday." "This way?" she said, pointing into the living room. Sirius nodded and followed her. "Wow, you've managed to do something with the living room. I didn't notice when I came in. Around her, the living room of 12 Grimwald Place was, behind the tables of food, somewhat less black than she remembered it to be in the summer. The carpets looked as if they had been replaced, and instead of the old, black, curtains the long windows were trimmed with chintz. Dumbledore found out an ancient spell that has done wonders. Molly Weasley crossed the carpet when she saw Cecilia, and handed her a plate. "Here, help yourself. There's plenty, and by the looks of it you need a good dinner inside you." "Thank you, Molly," said Cecilia, graciously. Glad to be free of Sirius's company, she headed to the end of the table and picked up a few sausage rolls. As she was reaching for a couple of cheese and pineapple on sticks, she realized she was standing next to Arthur Weasley. "Cecilia," he said warmly, "I am so glad to see you looking so well. And so proud of you this evening, after everything you've done." Cecilia could feel herself blushing at the lavish praise Mr. Weasley was heaping on her. "No, Mr. Weasley," said Cecilia, bashfully. "If it hadn't been for Tonks and Remus at the end of October, if it hadn't been for Harry and Ron helping me out last week, if it hadn't been for Dumbledore installing me as a teacher at Hogwarts, if it hadn't been for your hair too." Cecilia noticed him look around urgently, checking the coast was clear. "I wouldn't have been able to do it. And Severus, of course. It is a shame he couldn't be here this evening. He put in a lot of effort too." "I'm sure he did," said Mr. Weasley, ushering her to one of the settees where Charlie was sitting, chatting to Bathsheba. "However, without such a talented scientist, we wouldn't have it either. And my boys have been helping you out too?" Cecilia nodded. "That is so delightful to hear, especially after their October predicted grades came through." Molly hit the roof. "Tell me," he said, sitting on the arm of the settee as Cecilia sunk down into one of the cushions, "is it solid? Is it sound? The connection?" He saw a look cross her face as he spoke. "I only ask, Cecilia, because—" Cecilia put a hand on his arm and smiled at Arthur Weasley, who was trying desperately not to offend her. "The theory and practice, insofar as we have been able to ascertain, is firm," Cecilia agreed, nodding. "As sound as Box Tunnel. Or a Brindley Canal." She added, smiling as she used a comparison she knew Mr. Weasley would understand, and he nodded back in comprehension. "Then we shall rejoice in the day that our grandchildren will be taught the universal link at Hogwarts." He stopped in his exultation as Molly Weasley approached them. "Cecilia," she asked, looking crossly at her husband, "is the food to your liking?" Cecilia looked at her plate. She hadn't touched anything on it yet. "Lovely, Molly," she said, picking up one of the cheese and pineapple on sticks, and eating it. "I can't remember when I had such nice food." Molly sat down next to her, pushing Charlie further up the settee so she could sit next to Cecilia. "Good." She nodded, "and the Black Forest Gateau is particularly tasty," she added. "You do look thin, Cecilia," she continued maternally, unabashed. "Skipping meals, even if you are busy, is never a good thing. Now, the elf-made porridge, if I recall, is particularly delicious, and especially on these cold mornings will set you up a treat." "Molly," complained Arthur Weasley. "Surely it is up to Cecilia to decide what she does and does not want to eat." Molly gave him a look, and Arthur looked hard at a cheese and cucumber triangular sandwich on his plate before picking it up and taking a big bite out of it. "Cecilia dear," continued Mrs. Weasley, "I think it's marvelous what you have done. I have to ask, though." She paused, and Cecilia looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "It's not unnatural, is it? Not mole medicine? Only you said you needed blood?" A look of concern crossed her face, and Mrs. Weasley looked at her husband suspiciously. "In the end, they changed the way they did it, Molly," said Mr. Weasley. "Am I correct in saying that you used hair instead?" He looked quickly at Cecilia, who nodded in confirmation. "So," continued Molly, giving her husband another look, warning him not to interrupt again, "are the children well? Are they safe? How are Fred and George? Are they working hard? How about Ginny? And Ron? Is he doing the work you set? All perfectly well, said Cecilia, and I am particularly impressed with the work from the twins, and Ron in Mull studies. The twins are particularly gifted in humor. Mrs. Weasley, I expect you're very proud of their talent. And I can see that their keen interest in Mulls runs in the family. She turned to Mr. Weasley, who smiled back, clearly relishing the praise. Before Molly Weasley could say anything to match the expression on her face, Tonks came over to them. Cecilia! She exclaimed, taking her by the hand and pulling her off the sofa. Haven't seen you since we went back to your house, in October. Cecilia looked apologetically at Molly Weasley and her legs followed the rest of her as Tonks pulled her in the direction of the stairs. Got you out of there just in time, Tonks continued, pointing in the direction of Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley was patently ignoring her husband, turning to her son Charlie to speak loudly about the merits of achieving high grades in magical subjects, as opposed to Mull studies. So, how are you? Tired, admitted Cecilia. But relieved. I'm so glad to be finished it, if I'm honest. So you're going to be going home soon, then? Cecilia thought she caught a pang of disappointment in Tonks's voice. I suppose so, she replied. I've done the science, it's going to be up to Severus to come up with the potion. Cecilia's mind drifted to the potion that they were making that evening. You don't seem so sure, said Tonks, looking at her. I think you want to stay. And I think you want to see it through. Cecilia looked back at her. In my heart, it would be good to know that my work has contributed to defeating Voldemort. But I can't stay in the wizard world forever. And besides, I promised my family and my friends I'd be back for Christmas. Tonks nodded. But we can still keep in touch, though, Cecilia added. Unless Dumbledore uses a memory charm and I forget everything that's happened in the last 6 months, I'll still know who you are. She sighed. What's wrong, Cecilia? Asked the younger woman, putting a hand on her shoulder. I thought you'd be much happier with the outcome of this work than you are. Cecilia smiled slowly. I am, Tonks, she said. I don't know. I wish I could get to the bottom of all of this. There's more than just this universal connection between Mulls and wizards. Her eyes became animated, as she spoke and Tonks sat her down on the stairs. For a start, Cecilia continued, Raymond Lully. He's related to your family, he was in the ministry for a time and he was murdered during the Goblin riots. And there is a strange reference to a reciprocator, which I still don't understand. Surely someone that's done so much in his life would be more renowned. And yet, it's took me months to track down even the simplest piece of information. Another thing is Remus's book. I got the universal connection from that. Energy, light and magic. How is it that a book hundreds of years old with fairy tales in it had the very answer I was looking for, and was written before Raymond Lully, and... She stopped. Tonks looked at her, waiting for her to continue. One or two other things, random things, Cecilia finished weakly, as the name Joseph Black appeared in her mind. Including if we have everything right for the potion. But as far as I go, I've done what I was employed to do. I've solved the mystery and now we all know we are related by energy. She smiled weakly, feeling that now, having been freed of the burden of the elusive mystery, that was that for her in the wizard world. Did I ever tell you I think you're very brave, said Tonks, patting Cecilia on the shoulder again. After everything you've managed to achieve in the last few weeks. Whenever you do return to the Mull world I don't think anything will stop you from investigating all of this anyway. Tonks looked at Cecilia again, then lowered her head towards her. What about if? She stopped, looking up from Cecilia. Excuse me, Tonks, said Remus, looking at Cecilia. I was wondering whether I could speak to Mrs. Frobisher for a moment. I've spoken to Professor Dumbledore and I volunteered, he added cryptically. Tunks looked between Cecilia and Remus before jumping to her feet. "Sure," she said, her hair changing from somber brown to fuchsia pink. "See you later," she added, and made her way back to the buffet table. Remus watched her go before sitting down on the stairs next to Cecilia. She watched his face crease up with concentration before turning to her and smiling. How exhausted he looked, thought Cecilia. And much older than the night he escorted her to Hogsmeade Village to catch the night bus. Maybe not older, she reconsidered. Maybe just immensely careworn, with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Before she had a chance to ask what he had volunteered for, Remus looked Cecilia in the eye. "I hope you did not take my query this evening the wrong way, Cecilia. I did not intend to question your work and its safety. I do not believe for a single moment you would put Harry in danger." His blue eyes twinkled as he spoke, and Cecilia's heart began to soften. "It was an open forum, Remus, you were free to ask what you liked. But I am glad you said what you did. It gave others a chance to air their concerns." "But I am not concerned," he replied, looking at her carefully. "I was attempting to broach the subject which you mentioned to me when we were at your former place of work. That of a genetic sample of Harry's mother." Cecilia rewound her mental images to that night, of a cold autumn air tinged with frost, and Remus outside looking for her. "Yes," she thought. "I did mention it. I said it would make the process more straightforward." "It doesn't affect the result from the science-magic relationship," Cecilia replied, "though it would have helped to solve the puzzle quicker. But to make sure the potion that Severus makes is close to perfect, then yes, it would be valuable to have one. It would make the results more accurate." She swallowed. "Whatever Dumbledore's plans are, the closer the potion is to Harry's own magical energy, without his mother's genes overshadowing the results, the more effective it will be. I'm not speaking of safety now," she added. Remus nodded. "I understand. I must say," he continued, "I don't think I would be brave enough to do what you did this evening. It took a lot of courage to speak to us all tonight. I mean it," he insisted, as Cecilia tried to quell his praise by waving her hand in his direction. He took it, and held on to it. "I mean it," he repeated. "You came here, alone, to a place where you were injured last time. Don't tell me that hadn't crossed your mind." Remus looked at her again, and Cecilia dropped her head. Actually, she hadn't considered it, since she had made up with Sirius, but standing with the other Order members had made her feel very vulnerable. They stopped talking for a moment. Cecilia looked at Remus, his face still etched with concern, his pale eyes shimmering in the light. "There's something I need to tell you," Remus said eventually. "But not here." He got to his feet and began to make his way up the stairs. Cecilia got up too and followed him mutely. Remus walked along the first-floor corridor and to the end, turning left. Cecilia realized it was much darker here than the rest of the house, and began to feel a little uneasy. As she followed him to the right, she realized that actually, it wasn't the darkness that was making her feel unnerved, it was the absence of the previous owner shrieking at her for her to be gone from her house. Suddenly, Remus stopped and placed his hand on the handle of the door. He looked back at Cecilia before leaning on the handle. "Much better," he said, opening the creaking door quietly. Cecilia followed him into a dimly lit study. It had the feel of an 18th-century gentleman's room. The walls were lined with books in oak shelves, and in the center of the room, two wing-backed chairs sat at angles to one another with a small low table, also in oak, between them. "So," Cecilia said, looking round at the books on the shelves, dusty and ancient. "What do you need to tell me?" Remus looked at her sharply, then softened, gesturing towards one of the chairs. "Lumos," he said. "I wish we could get the lighting sorted out in here," he added, sitting in the other. Wall sconces flickered into light at his spell, illuminating the room with golden candlelight. Cecilia turned in her chair to speak to Remus again when he began to speak. Tonight, just before you arrived, the Order voted unanimously that you should be aware of what I am about to reveal to you. We felt that, as a member too, and also because you are a mole, we could not keep it from you. On Halloween, he continued, still looking at her, Voldemort launched an attack on moles. He used a form of magic that was dangerous and devastating, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of moles across Britain. His voice was slow and calm, and Cecilia tried to remember the time when she had heard it before. But before her mind could consider it, Cecilia felt her heart sink as she ran over the information. Hundreds of moles. She tried to get to her feet, but the muscles in her legs would not let her stand. She looked back at Remus and felt her brow buckle. When you say hundreds, who were they? How? Even as she spoke she knew she sounded pitiful, but the images that Tonks had, which she had seen of the man and his daughter dying in agony on the top of the multi-story car park, filtered into her mind. Almost 800, said Remus. There was no apparent pattern. It happened all over the country, and the victims were of all ages. There's never been more than a dozen on Halloween. It was totally unprecedented. Mole baiting, he added, stopping when he saw the look of horror on Cecilia's face. Mole baiting, Cecilia repeated, shaking her head firmly, and pushed herself out of the armchair. Her legs felt shaky and she could feel a tide of nausea wash over her. She took a few steps towards the window, curtained with black drapes, folding her arms and trying to come to terms with what Remus was saying. It shouldn't be called mole baiting, Cecilia said after a while, addressing the window. That implies that moles are vermin to be killed for sport. It should be called what it is. Time passed as her mind ran over the information Remus had given to her. Genocide. She finished kettly. Hundreds of moles. Not one or two, but whole streets. Young children, girls and boys. Young people, teenagers, pensioners. Could have been anyone. Could have been. Just then she felt Remus's soft hand on her right arm, and Cecilia turned and looked at him in the eye. Was there anyone? From Edgeford? She stopped, faltering over the question she both wanted to ask, but didn't want to know the answer to, if it was one that was going to be unbearable. Murdered? Remus's face didn't move, but he began to rub her arm, comfortingly. No, he said firmly. Cecilia's body began to untense and she turned to look at Remus. Thank you for telling me, she said, finally. Thank you for volunteering. It means a lot, coming from you. Cecilia smiled in gratitude, and tears sprang to her eyes. Not tears of anything in particular. Would you like to be alone for a while? Remus took a few steps away from her, and stood next to the coffee table. Cecilia nodded. No shame in it, she told herself. I'll regain my composure and go back down then, she thought, feeling the tears flowing much easier now. Cecilia was grateful when Remus said nothing else, but left her in the room alone. She stepped towards the chair she had been sitting on a few minutes ago and leaned back in it, allowing her tears to fall unashamedly down her cheeks. Mole baiting. People over the whole country randomly struck down by Voldemort. No one from Edgeford. Not Mum or Amy. Not Libby or Derek or Freya. As the tears dripped onto her trousers, she aimlessly wiped her hands across her face. Why had this happened? It's got to stop, she thought firmly, otherwise, someone she loved would get killed. Harry's got to stop this, using the potion. As she thought about her search again, and the new weapon, Cecilia's mind began to work pragmatically, which it was wont to do when she was feeling emotional. She could go, she thought. Severus has everything we need. If he doesn't, he will be able to sort it out. But what if he can't? A little voice in her head whispered into her cerebellum. What if he ends up struggling with his commitment to being Dumbledore's spy? Like this evening? Cecilia shuffled in the chair and slipped off her shoes, pulling her knees up to her chest and holding them as she thought. And if I stay to the end, what's to say I'm actually going to make a difference? Draco Malfoy thinks I'm a squib, and nearly killed me then. I'll have to carry on doing what I'm doing and keep my head down. And what will I be able to do more than I already have done? The library is exhausted, and none of the teachers are likely to be able to tell me about Joseph Black, Raymond Lully or anything else. Cecilia's mind rested on Joseph Black. Surely it couldn't be a coincidence that the Joseph Black mentioned in Draco's diary and the one in her encyclopedia had the same birth and death dates. Her mind fixed on the face in the picture, monochrome and sour, but with hints of family resemblance. Were they one and the same person? Yet Joseph Black of the diary had, by the look of it, been entrenched in the whole doctrine of pure blood and nobility, and the scientist Joseph Black had made progress in the modern steam engine, a contemporary of James Watt. There's more to this, said Cecilia aloud, as her tears reduced to intermittent sobs and she looked around the room she was sitting in. There has to be. Are you talking to me? Cecilia looked round in alarm when she realized she was being spoken to. Who's there? She asked, looking round and getting to her feet. She looked at the door, but it was shut too, just the way Remus had left it 10 minutes ago. Remus? She added, hoping that it was someone, at least, and she wasn't going slightly mad. Phineas Nigellus, intoned the voice. Where was it coming from, thought Cecilia, looking round. Over here, came the voice again, sounding slightly bored, but also irritated. Above the fireplace, it added, dolefully. Cecilia stopped her search for the voice around the bookshelves and turned. Above the fireplace hung a picture of an old wizard, black hat and very old, thin face to match the thin, reedy, creaking voice. She smiled. Hello, said Cecilia, wiping the last of her tears away from her cheek and stepping now away from the books near the window to the fireless hearth. I've seen you before, I think. She tilted her head sideways, trying to remember where. I hang, intoned Phineas, on the wall in young Dumbledore's office. Maybe it is there? During the frequent occasions my successor in his wisdom has permitted your presence there, such as this morning? Cecilia's expression changed to one of semi-comprehension, Phineas's tone of bored sarcasm lost on her. Yes, said Cecilia, smiling. You were a headmaster ... so why are you here? This is my house, replied Phineas. Phineas Nigellus. And you are the mole that the last of my line has not been able to remain silent about for months. Cecilia closed her mouth, feeling foolish. The last of his line? Sirius? Then a thought struck her. Phineas? She asked tentatively, her thoughts beginning to race. May I call you that? You may. Phineas Nigellus intoned, looking over his spectacles as if ceding for the very last time to a mole. When Professor Dumbledore made me a teacher of mole studies at Hogwarts, you all, the portraits of the previous headmasters and headmistresses should I say, agreed to help me if I needed it. Cecilia paused and despite herself, lowered her head and spoke quietly. Indeed we did, replied Phineas. Though I will add that any assistance I afford to you will be only because I am compelled to. Being a headmaster at Hogwarts means that one owes a certain loyalty to the present one, however misguided. It is about the work Dumbledore is doing, Cecilia added, making sure Phineas was absolutely clear that what she was about to ask fitted into that category. I need to find out about an ancestor of Sirius '(S.) and yours. She looked expectantly at the portrait. Oh yes? Phineas gave Cecilia a sidelong glance, or at least as sidelong as a two-dimensional portrait can. And who might that be? Cecilia shifted from one foot to another. Joseph Black, she replied, smiling a little. Phineas stared back at her. Eventually he spoke. The First Black. 1728 to 1799. Cura impotenta. No power without blood. He glanced at the shelves over on the opposite walls. Well, I would say that you could look in the family diaries, but it would seem young Sirius has disposed of them. Now, why would Emil want to know about Joseph Black? His methods are well out of favor in wizard circles these days, girl. Cecilia turned back from the vacant floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves. I think he's got something to do with the work we've been doing at Hogwarts, she replied, looking back earnestly. What do you mean, the First Black? The First Black, said Phineas. The first to declare moles to be vermin, and that true power lay in the spilling of as much blood as possible. The originator of the noble houses. Cecilia gaped as he spoke, odiously and expressionless. She swallowed. So, the motto, she said, ignoring Phineas's comments. No power without blood. Joseph Black, said Phineas. He introduced the family tree for purer blood wizards. Those who were pure and wished to keep their lineage so made sure all pure and noble families did the same, to ensure no mud could enter the pure rivers of wizardkind. Quite right too, in my opinion. Phineas, said Cecilia, pushing on before her mind realized what she was doing and stopped her. What made him take such a line against moles? Did anything happen while he was a scientist? Cecilia swallowed, looking back at Phineas in his frame carefully. A look of incomprehension passed over Phineas's face and his brow wrinkled. What is it you mean by this? He snapped, looking annoyed. Joseph Black did the greatest service to wizardkind when he organized purification, and now those that still believe his teachings are sought after and will be killed using whatever it is you have been working on. The modern age, so I am to understand it, according to young Dumbledore. Now, I will leave you. Search in as many books as you please for whatever it is you require, that's if there are any left. Good day. And with that, Phineas Nigellus froze in his frame and faded from animated bright colors to dull, somber pigments. Hello, said Cecilia, stepping nearer to the frame, then looked round at the bookshelves in the room when she realized Phineas had actually left. He must have taken offense at her curiosity, thought Cecilia as she walked slowly across the Persian design carpet which lay across the oak floorboards towards the empty shelves. And I didn't get a chance to ask him about Raymond Lully, she thought as she looked at the spaces where Phineas had just told her the Black family diaries had been, and cursed her misfortune again that Sirius had got rid of them. They would have been extremely useful if bizarre. Just then, a book on the shelf next to the empty one caught her eye. The title was written in gold, embossed on the dark blue spine. Ye Old Magic, it read, and its thick spine jutted out a little from the shelf. Okay, Phineas, said Cecilia aloud, I'll search as many books as I like, and she glanced to her right, past Ye Old Magic to the rest of the books on the shelves. There might still be something about Joseph Black in one of them. I'll start with this one, thought Cecilia, placing her hand on it. Close to it actually, for when she tried to remove it from the shelf she found that it was stuck, as if superglued to the shelf. Damn, said Cecilia, annoyed, and turned to Phineas's dull frame. So I suppose you don't mind me looking at any of these as long as I can get them off the shelves, then. Giving up on Ye Old Magic, she scanned the shelves, testing a few for their fixedness. One or two seemed wedged, though not stuck, though one shot sparks at her as Cecilia moved her hand in front of it and she jerked her arm away from it, shocked. HMP. She huffed and gave Phineas's portrait before crossing back over the carpet and looking at the books on the opposite shelves. One title caught her eye and Cecilia tentatively pulled 200 Years of Glorious Purity off the shelf. and was still standing facing the bookshelves as she read over the 3 pages for the 5th time, and yet again that evening Cecilia's mind endured further marvelous, shocking and potentially dangerous information which, while explaining some things, posed further questions. It would seem that Joseph Black of the family Black had a daughter, Honoria, who had fallen in love with a mole. In order to prevent her from marrying the man, Joseph had swept through tough legislation proposals within the Wizengamot, an assembly which Cecilia knew to be akin to a parliamentary house. Amongst those proposals condemned mole-born wizards and squibs to carry fake wands so they could be distinguished amongst a crowd. In addition, they were stripped of bank accounts with contents of over 10,000 galleons, lest they foolishly decided to use them solely in the mole world, thus impoverishing wizards in the years to come. And thirdly, he proclaimed that for purity of the wizard world, pure blood marriages were the ideal. By the sounds of it, Joseph Black was not supported wholly in the parliament, but he carried on pushing his reforms through influential friends and supporters, by force and also by intimidation, until finally they became laws. Just to bring his daughter into line, Cecilia thought aloud. But then, it's never just, is it? I bet this wasn't the first time purity and nobility and blood were first proclaimed superior. Cecilia lowered the still open book and looked back up at Phineas's portrait. And that attitude of yours, Phineas, said Cecilia, her eyes filling with tears again, caused people to die. Innocence. She closed the book quickly and reshelved, resisting the urge to throw it on the floor angrily. Then she walked over to the window and looked out of it, down onto the back streets of Grimmauld Place and the street adjacent, moving up her left arm to wipe her face again. Just then she felt a hand touch her gently on the shoulder. "Remus told me you were here." Sirius walked round to her left and looked at her, his dark tempestuous eyes staring directly into hers. "He told me he had volunteered to tell you the news about Halloween." Cecilia nodded, wiping her face with her arm again, and took a step back from him. "I came to see how you are," he continued, looking at the space where Cecilia hadn't replaced the book quite as she had found it. "And it's a good job that I did. You've been in our world long enough to know that you should never turn your back on anything. Looks like I was just in time. Some of these are lethal." Cecilia smiled, and Sirius returned it. "He did," said Cecilia. "And it made me reconsider what I need to do now. I hope you don't mind. I was looking for further information about someone who's quite intriguing." "Not at all," replied Sirius, taking her by her shoulder and ushering her away from the shelves. "You were very lucky not to have come to harm," he added, glancing at the books. They glistened in the candlelight. "Some of these have quite a sting. However, you won't find anything about Lully, believe me. Moony and I have been through them all at least half or dozen times." Cecilia stood next to the chair in which she had sat just now and hesitated, looking quickly at the door. Sirius followed her glance. "That was a brave thing you did tonight," he said, his eyes twinkling as he looked Cecilia in the eye before sitting in the chair Remus had occupied 3/4 of an hour earlier. "You looked very nervous." Cecilia nodded, sitting down in the chair and looking down. "I was," she admitted. "It was a bit of a surprise from Dumbledore that I was coming here. And public speaking. I don't like it, usually." "But you're a teacher," said Sirius, grinning. "You stand up in front of children for 6 hours a day and speak. How can you not like public speaking when you do it for a living?" "Teaching's not the same as presenting," explained Cecilia. "When you are a teacher you know that at least they have to a certain extent got to listen to you and do what you ask. And you also know that they know something. Here in your world. Well, you heard the questions, even though they were managed by Dumbledore. Even Remus asked me about safety." "Well, at least that's going to be a weight off your mind," said Sirius, looking at her again. "At least the work is in Severus Snape's safe hands. he added, and the expression in his voice reminded Cecilia of the rivalry she had seen in Minerva's memory, of the young rival wizards at school. "Absolutely," said Cecilia, rallying to Snape's defense. "He knows as much as I do about the Mole-Wizard connection, and with his skills in potion-making I'm sure it won't take very long for him to come up with the potions." Sirius nodded slowly. "It looks like it's working out to plan, then," he said. "And a happy day it will be when Voldemort is defeated. Although I can't say I am pleased about the risk Harry is going to be taking, even if you do say that it will be minimal. Tea?" He pulled out his wand and waved it across the low table. Cecilia looked between the cups and Sirius, and the long-buried thoughts of the summer flooded her mind like an unexpected wave at the beginning of high tide. "Not just at the moment," she replied, getting up from her seat. "I was wondering, Sirius, you have an extensive collection of books here, and your ancestor, Phineas," she gestured to his lifeless portrait, "was filling me in on some of the details of your family. Although I couldn't find anything of significance about Raymond Lully. I hope you don't mind my looking," she added. "Not at all," again, said Sirius, putting down his unsipped tea. "You just asked me that, Cecilia," he reminded her. "Your ancestor, Joseph Black," said Cecilia, moving towards the book that Sirius had reshelved correctly. "He seems to have been behind quite a bit of anti-mole legislation in the late 18th century. And because of his daughter's interest in a mole." She took the book from the shelf and opened it to the appropriate page. Sirius crossed over to look at the pages she had opened. "Joseph Black?" he asked, looking between the book and Cecilia. "I thought you were interested in Raymond Lully. What's Joseph Black got to do with any of this?" Cecilia shook her head. "I don't know, Sirius," she said. "It's just that his name, and dates of birth and death have appeared in 3 very separate places, connecting science, Lully, your family, mysterious mythology. I just know there's something more to this than what I've found out, and I'm determined to get to the bottom of it before I go home for good. Is there anything more you can tell me, Sirius, that might help the work? To help towards Harry's potion being the best we can make for him?" Sirius said nothing, but took the book from her and reshelved it again, then returned to his chair. Cecilia watched as Sirius stared at the fireplace, the look of impetuosity, pride and overconfidence all but draining from him as he stared. Eventually Cecilia crossed back, crouched by him. "If it will help Harry," said Cecilia, "please tell me." Sirius continued to stare at the fireplace, still unlit, and she wondered whether she had crossed yet another invisible line. Cecilia was about to get up, but Sirius turned his head to look at her, his eyes red as if trying to hold back tears. "My accursed family has been nothing but a blight on my life. They have ruined everything that I held dear, and not just my parents. My ancestors through their ways. Joseph Black with his reforms, as you say. Alpard Black. Have you heard of him?" Cecilia shook her head mutely. "You'd love him, Cecilia. A wonderful relative of mine who would bait moles and then, instead of killing them, would use them for experimentation. Revived the long-forgotten anti-mole laws and traditions during the 1920s, those which Voldemort found ever so appealing and fitting for his cause." Sirius held on to the arms of the chair, his fingers played as if, were he to let go, he would not be responsible for his angry actions. "My glorious family. The noble house of Black. Cura in potentia. Why?" he shouted in Cecilia's direction, making her jump. "Why was I made to learn about him and his honorable deeds? Why must I be a part of all of this? Why is my life blackened like my name?" He got to his feet and walked towards the fireplace, leaning his elbow on it and looking at the wall. "But you are not like them," said Cecilia, when Sirius had stopped talking bitterly to himself. "I can't see that you are, not now I've got to know you. It's understandable that you want to protect Harry, any godfather would. But it is for Harry that I wish to know, What Dumbledore is pressing for will happen in any case, and I don't think you'd be able to stop it." She stopped in the process of getting to her feet as he shot her a look. "Cecilia, you intend to return back to the Muggle world. And you intend to do so by Christmas. I would urge you to do just that, for any information you seek, whether within Hogwarts or without, will put you in more and more danger as the time to use the new weapon approaches. Even here you risk death, even with the order downstairs." Cecilia looked at him. "Oh yes?" She laughed. "How is that? From your violent books? Or do you have a house elf you've not told me about who is under a blood deed on your word?" She smiled, and Sirius smiled too. "I have something for you," Cecilia continued, reaching into her trouser pocket. She didn't know why she had kept it there. To stop Snape from finding it, she could easily have thrown it away. Cecilia pulled out the remains of the hair he had given to her that morning, the morning of her birthday. She walked over to him and placed it on the mantelpiece. "I would not have been able to get to the correct answer if it hadn't been for this." She looked between it and back at Sirius, who was staring at it. "Your genetics played an important role in this, and no matter what you say, how much your family have ruined your life, what made them has also made for the downfall of their beliefs." Sirius's eyes met hers, and as she withdrew her hand he took it. Cecilia felt her heart begin to beat faster as he pulled her closer. A grown woman shouldn't behave like this, a tiny voice in the back of her mind told her sharply, but it was soon silenced by bigger, wieldier voices trampling it to death, and Cecilia's mind was filled with that autumn morning with the sun glinting through the long passage under Hogwarts. "You believe in science," he said quietly. "Is that what's keeping you going, when things get difficult?" Cecilia shook her head. "Science isn't a belief. It's a way of perceiving the world. And even though it's difficult to change the way you think about things, sometimes, in the face of evidence, like tonight, you have to. Which means you have to change the way you look at other things as well." "Such as?" Sirius moved his face closer to Cecilia, his onyx eyes glittering in the candlelight, and she felt her pulse rate quicken by her ears, pounding and rhythmical. "Other people," she said, looking. "That voice in your head that tells you different when you are convinced that each person you know cannot be any other way, and they change. A belief in the impossible." "I believed in something once," said Sirius, taking a step away from her and walking back over to the window. "I believed that I would marry a beautiful witch and teach my children to fly their first broom. Then when that wasn't to be, I believed I would always have Lily and James, and that our work would always ensure that the villains wouldn't get away with it.